Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, August 12th, 2020. My name is Drew Clark, editor and publisher. Very excited to welcome you to another of our series. We've been doing a series called Champions of Broadband for the past 3 weeks, and we'll continue for the rest of August as well. And I guess you could consider this a version, Champions of Broadband, because we're going to be talking today with people on our staff here at Broadband Breakfast, our reporters and editors, including myself. So they'll ask me some questions too, and I'll ask them some questions. We really appreciate your watching us. Every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, we bring together the broadband community to talk about issues surrounding the application use, as well as the infrastructure and investment in getting better broadband, better lives. That's our motto here at Broadband Breakfast. We've been doing this as a company, as a news site for 12 years, and we will continue. In addition to the news that we provide, we also host events. And in particular, we do this event every week, and we also just concluded an event on digital infrastructure investment that we held 2 days ago. Very good discussions and content that we had during that discussion. Next week at this event, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, we'll be joined by Thomas Hazlett. He's a professor and economist who's focused and written extensively, just on everything from radio regulation, the origin of the FCC, to cable laws and the economics of them, to you name it, broadband investment. So very excited that Tom will be joining us next Wednesday. But today we're going to be talking with Emily McPhee, Jericho Casper, and Elijah Labby. Thank you all for being with us here. And I'm just going to switch around to that view of Elijah. So. Emily, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you've learned about broadband in your work at Broadband Breakfast.
Well, hi, it's good to be here. I am the assistant editor of Broadband Breakfast. I started out as a reporter in early last year, and I really enjoyed it. I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, broadband connections have become so much more important than ever. And I think over the last years, I've learned about all these issues of connectivity, especially in terms of education, telehealth, remote working. There are so many important applications that really make it necessary to improve connectivity, especially for people in rural areas.
Thanks. Sometimes, Emily, we get asked this question about what is broadband, and like literally, how do you define broadband? Because sometimes people go, well, like, isn't broadband going to be different from one year to the next, or one decade to the next? Just tell us how you would answer that question about what broadband is.
And I think essentially it's, when we're talking about this in a more general sense, it's connectivity. It's being able to have an internet connection and be digitally connected to the rest of the world.
So in your work at Broadband Breakfast, will you tell us about some of the things that you've focused on, written about, or some of the other role you've played as an editor, assistant editor here at Broadband Breakfast? Emily, you still there?
So like you mentioned a moment ago, we focus on the infrastructure component of broadband and then also the application and use. So a lot of my reporting has been very focused on that application and use side of things, specifically with social media, the regulation of social media, Section 230, and how we use the internet to interact with each other. What should be the rules governing that?
Cool. Thank you very much. Let's turn to Jericho. Jericho Casper is a reporter with Broadband Breakfast. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you've learned at Broadband in your work at Broadband Breakfast. And make sure to unmute yourself.
All right. Hi, I'm Jericho. Thanks for having me, Drew. I'm excited to be here. I recently graduated from the UVA Media Studies Department, and this is my first job reporting, and I've learned a lot. specifically about broadband, I learned that a lot of federal funding doesn't make it to the end user, or it doesn't make it there efficiently. And then also I kind of came to understand the ins and outs of the Federal Communications Commission and learned how slow or fast they work depending on the priorities. So learned a lot so far this summer.
It's a really key point about, the FCC can move fast when it wants to, but it may not necessarily want to all the time. Let me ask you the same question I asked Emily. How do you define broadband? If someone were to ask you that, if your mom or grandma were to say, hey, what is this broadband? What does that mean? How would you answer that, Jericho?
Yeah, I liked Emily's answer. It's connectivity at the end of the day. I think that symmetrical speeds are really important because I think that we should be able to create and upload and share just as much as we're downloading information and receiving information. So that's something I'm passionate about. I learned a lot. I had just different connections throughout my life, and I have had a fiber connection finally for the first time this summer, and it's been fantastic. So I think fiber is important, and symmetrical speeds, and yeah, just connectivity.
We on Broadband Breakfast's About page, you can find links to each of the articles that all of our reporters and editors have written, as well as a short bio about themselves. And one of the things I remember about Jericho's bio is she said she's passionate about making sure that people get high quality connection because, and I think you referenced your experience growing up, I believe in Newport News. Could you tell a little bit about that and about some of the connectivity issues that you experienced and how that's shaped your view of broadband?
Yeah. So I didn't have too many connectivity issues in Newport News, but it's more in that area. It's more an issue of affordability. And so something else I learned here is half of the battle is affordability. But throughout my life, yeah, as a child, I didn't have internet because it was an affordability issue. We had a college across the street, and my mom was just like, if you want to go, you can just walk across the street and use the internet there. So that was my first experience with that. And then, yeah, in college was another issue. I had a DSL connection with my roommates, and we couldn't get anything done once we moved to working from home. We had to battle each other for the connection. Our Zooms would not connect. It was rough, and it really affected the education process, honestly.
I was just talking with another individual at a broadband company earlier this morning, and she and I were talking about how crucial the pandemic has made it for us to recognize that you have one or two parents working most times at home. They've got their kids. Everyone's trying to Zoom or to StreamYard or Google Hangouts or whatever your connection method is, and they're really literally battling over the bandwidth, right? And that's happening perhaps for the first time. And so I just have not heard anyone say, oh yeah, 10 megs or 25 megs is enough, because it is just not enough. I can tell you that from my experience, and would kind of invite other thoughts and stories on this as we go through our discussion here today. But let's turn now to Elijah Labby. Elijah, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've learned about broadband in the work you've been doing here at Broadband Breakfast. Okay, I'm not hearing you here. Let's try again here. Okay, try again. Having connectivity issues. Let's try one more time here. I know you've been playing with a different method here. Okay, let's try that. Okay. Go ahead, Elijah. We're still not hearing you. He'll try again, I'm sure. Emily or Jericho, do you have any thoughts on this question of greater stress on broadband networks because of the coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really widespread problem when you have big families or multiple people trying to access the same connection, and suddenly people are working from home, people are studying from home. That's going to be a problem, and it's going to put additional strain on the network that wasn't there before. And because it is new, we simply just don't have the infrastructure to handle that, or not everyone has the infrastructure to be able to handle that. And that all happened very suddenly.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we've got Elijah back. So let me go ahead and turn to you. Make sure to unmute your mic and tell us about yourself and what you've learned about broadband.
Well, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, great. I don't know what happened. Yeah, so I'm a reporter. I'm a junior at Seminole State College of Florida, and I came to Broadband Breakfast through the National Journalism Center, and it's really been a treat. I've really gotten to write so many more articles than I ever would have imagined. I had a published article on my first day, and so it's been a pleasure. And I guess what I've learned about broadband and how I would define it is just the plethora of different ways that we can get people that need what is increasingly becoming um, or maybe already has become a life necessity, the coronavirus, so that it's impossible to continue doing school or doing work in the vast majority of situations without high-speed broadband. So it's been a pleasure to cover our shift and hopefully increasingly effective move towards universal broadband.
What are some of the more surprising things, or things you might not have expected about broadband or technology generally, Elijah? What are things that you learned that surprised you based on covering this issue matter for the last 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, well, I think I always knew that government generally is highly inefficient, but I don't think that I really had a good grasp on how inefficient it could be until I had to close up follow bills and things like that. You have a bunch of different broadband bills that may or may not go anywhere, and so that's been really enlightening to watch.
Yeah, observing the functionality or non-functionality of our Congress firsthand. We've got a comment or a question here from Sean McLaughlin, who's a regular watcher. Thank you, Sean. Symmetrical connections are a goal for community media, reflecting our need to have a voice and create information rather than a bias toward consumption. Let me actually start with you, Jericho, on this one. You mentioned symmetrical connections, and I now have a symmetrical connection at my home through a fiber connection with Verizon Fios. Very happy to finally have that fiber connection. Talk a bit more about that symmetrical point and what you meant, and maybe build off of what Sean has asked there, Jericho.
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Sean. So yeah, I just think it's important, as I was saying, to be able to share as much as you're intaking information. So I think that, and then there's like different devices that are better for creating and rather than intaking. So also another thing that's important is getting people those devices that they can be creating and sharing. I think mobile is less geared towards creating and sharing thoughts and critical thoughts.
So one piece of this, and Emily alluded to this, is there's both the piece about infrastructure, and then there's the piece about the application and use of content on that infrastructure. So does a symmetrical connection bear to the application and use? What are your thoughts on that, Emily and Elijah?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with what Jericho was saying about being able to not only take in information from online, but also to create and put your own thoughts out via the internet, that's literally application and use. Having the infrastructure is really just the building block in order to get to that application and use component to be able to both receive and share information.
How Emily, how have you used the video conferencing capacities of of broadband since the pandemic? How has it changed your day-to-day life to make use of those applications and uses of broadband?
I mean, as you know, over the last maybe 4 or 5 months, I've moved around several times and had a different strength of connection in each place. And it really makes a huge difference now that, you know, we work remotely, I take classes remotely, I talk to my friends remotely. Everything is over the strength of the connection. And it's not only about my connection, right? It's about everyone's connection that I'm working with. So I had a class where the professor did not have a strong internet connection. So that's, you know, that makes it so that no one really gets the benefit of the class. It's really so interconnected, and it needs to be universal connection, universal connectivity. Otherwise, it doesn't work really for anyone that's participating.
Oh, that is such a great point. People used to talk all the time about the telephone network and how each additional person on the telephone network makes it more valuable. But that point is not made nearly enough. That is to say that if there's one person on a Zoom call with a bad connection, it's going to affect the other people on the call. Elijah, what would you add on this point we've been talking about the connectivity, the symmetricality?
Well, I would add that. I would add to what I said previously. It's been very enlightening to watch the slow process towards increasing the quality, not only the quality, but the availability of broadband. But to what Jericho was saying about people having the ability not only to receive, not only have incoming traffic, but also outgoing traffic at both at a high speed. It's been incredibly heartening to see the efforts that a lot of private and public organizations have taken to increase this sort of access. Like David Jelke, who I overlapped with,
a previous reporter with Broadband Breakfast. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. He covered libraries' efforts to connect people, whether that's through lending hotspots or allowing people to park and do work in their parking lots. Some of my pieces kind of overlapped with that idea and referenced them. So obviously, it's an ongoing mission, but it is inspiring to see, and you hope to see more of it in the future.
Cool. I want to ask each of you about some of the stories that you've written for us. I'm going to start with Jericho. In particular, you did a kind of a profile of Danville, Virginia, and a broadband network there. What did you? I guess I should say what was unique, or what did you discover was unique about that Danville network from doing that piece, that article?
Yeah, thank you, Drew. I hadn't heard about open access networks until I started working at Broadband Breakfast. So writing Danville and doing that, I studied one of the first open access networks in the US, which is essentially an open access network splits the traditional vertically integrated internet ownership model apart. And something that story really made me understand was the importance of local champions. I interviewed some of the local champions of Danville for it, and that was kind of my first, contact looking into a local situation. And so it really made me appreciate the work that they did. And it also, writing the story made me realize, it made me a true believer of the necessity of different models to fully serve the American public with internet access. So yeah, I was grateful to learn about that.
We'll put these articles on this page for this event, so those who are watching this will have a chance to click on them and see them in particular. And again, all these are available on Broadband Breakfast. Tell us also about the piece you did about Disconnection Day, Jericho. That was a great effort, and I'd love to hear your take on putting that together and what's kind of come of it since.
Thanks. Disconnection Day was a story I wrote about the end of the Keep Americans Connected pledge that was an effort by AGPI and the FCC that basically telecom providers wouldn't cut off connections or they would extend service to customers and not cut off their connections through the pandemic. to a certain date, which is slipping my mind at this point. But
June
I
30th.
think,
June
okay,
30th.
there you go. So something that story encapsulated to me was that big telecom providers are only going to do so much for the American public. And interviewing the public for the story, I learned that many don't feel like they're being served adequately by these providers. And again, I already mentioned this, but writing that story did make me realize that affordability is half of the battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And we definitely have affordability issues, and that's kind of one issue we come back to. Americans' rate of broadband, how much we pay per megabyte is, or megabit per second, I guess, is very much higher. And we maybe haven't done anything directly recently on that, but that's a good point and something we need to continue to focus on. Elijah, step back a bit to this piece you did on big tech. This was very recently. You did an article about the hearing in person, but the tech executives weren't there in person. So big tech must be broken up, says House Antitrust Subcommittee Chairman. Tell us a little bit about how you're seeing the tech industry being treated in Washington right now.
It's fascinating. You see Republicans taking what I would argue are typically or historically not Republican positions. They want to regulate these private companies. And so it's been very interesting to watch that sort of staunch conservative, unregulated business is the goal. We're going to punish these companies because we believe that they're threatening free speech or they're acting anti-competitively. And so that's been fascinating. And writing that piece was really illuminating. Going down to that hearing, a couple of weeks ago was very enjoyable to watch.
What really look into your crystal ball, Elijah, and tell us what you see the future for those big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. How do you see them being treated over the coming years here in Washington?
It's difficult to say because in my opinion, the move to being extremely hawkish toward big tech, especially on the part of Republicans, is relatively recent. They've always alleged that there's anti-conservative bias, but as far as actually breaking them up, that's been relatively recent. So I would say it's likely to get worse before it gets better. But how bad it gets and whether it leads to a breakup or significant penalties for these companies is very difficult to say because the companies are so large. It would be a monumental task for them to break up. And actually, a piece that I wrote a couple days ago said that the majority of Americans do not believe that Congress will break up Amazon or Google. So it doesn't seem that public opinion is necessarily on the side of breaking up either.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that is in some degree of limbo, but they're not being treated with kid gloves anymore. Let me ask Jericho one more question before we turn to Emily. This is actually from Sean McLaughlin here. We never got to see any of the providers' Wi-Fi hotspots open to any American for free. Did anyone get a benefit from the industry FCC's fake response to COVID? That Sean raises an excellent point there. That was one part of the pledge to open Wi-Fi hotspots we didn't really hear much about. Any thoughts on that, Jericho?
Yeah, I didn't look into that for my piece. I didn't know about that, but I guess I didn't hear anything either looking into it. Does anyone else know anything?
It was part of the pledge, one of those things that kind of quickly disappeared, right? I mean, one of the three prongs, no late charges. okay, and no cutoffs and open hotspots, right? So Sean's raising another point for us to focus on. Does anyone else?
Oh, it would have been good to include.
Yeah, well, we can do a follow-up on that. Let's turn to you, Emily. You worked as a reporter at Broadband Breakfast last summer, and this summer you've been assistant editor. During both times, you've covered Section 230. What are some thoughts you've had on the evolution of that issue over this time?
Well, one thing that's just been really interesting is how big of a deal it's become this summer with, I mean, the middle of a global pandemic, I guess, is not really the time that I expected the President of the United States to become fixated on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. But it was a big deal, especially a couple months ago with Trump's executive order, which was probably pretty legally unenforceable, but still, as someone that I talked to for one of the stories about that said it doesn't really matter whether it's unenforceable or not. The fact is that this has become politicized, and this is, shaping the way that we look at this. This will shape the way that different agencies treat it in the future, whether or not the executive order itself actually carries legislative weight. But I think that the other interesting thing is that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have signaled that they want to get rid of or significantly modify Section 230 protections. And just to be clear, Section 230 is what allows internet platforms, social media platforms to not be held liable for third-party content. So if that were to disappear, then they could potentially be held liable for third-party content, which could potentially lead to less content moderation or much more extreme content moderation, both of which would probably significantly change the internet as we know it. Then there are others that say that actually the First Amendment would jump in and it would be essentially the same. But I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty because we don't know what the internet looks like without Section 230.
Here's another comment from our friend Sean. Platform regulation is the next iteration of media regulation as predicted by Harold Feld at Public Knowledge. What do you think of that? What's your take, Emily, on platform regulation as media regulation and how this compares to efforts to regulate media such as the Fairness Doctrine?
Actually, what Elijah was saying earlier about Republicans taking less traditionally conservative stances on the internet, that reminded me of the Fairness Doctrine, because the Republican Party has long been against the Fairness Doctrine. I think the 2016 Republican platform included a section that was against the Fairness Doctrine, even though that was no longer applicable. But this attempt to say that social media platforms and internet platforms have to be neutral in some way is, I think some would argue that that is actually doing the opposite of what it intends to. If it's intending to protect free speech, coming up with some idea of neutrality, some idea of these are the perspectives that need to all be shared and all be shared equally, that to me seems like very strict regulation of speech and something that has the potential to be really, really abused in the future, even if at first it appears to be sort of like the Fairness Doctrine, making things fair and equal. That could really go a lot further than I think people intended to.
No, great point. Elijah and Jericho, do you have other thoughts on this question of Section 230?
I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but it is interesting to see, when you talk about that kind of media regulation and things like that, as it relates to Section 230, when it came to thefederalist.com and Zero Hedge, I'm not sure if you recall this, but they both, Zero Hedge had their Google Ads support revoked because their comments section, allegedly contained, hateful speech that wasn't necessarily that of the owner of Zero Hedge or any of its contributors. but the Federalist was able, if I'm remembering correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Federalist was able to avoid this Google Ads revocation by just getting rid of their comments section. So while I think that allegations of platform bias and media regulation um, are have the potential to be legitimate, it's not as if someone is swooping in overnight and shutting down um, uh, traffic to your website um, via just you have the option to remove this hateful content, and I would count myself as believing in some traditional conservative principles, and frankly I think that like I was saying earlier, the right of a private business to say we don't want to support a website that has such hateful content, it seems to me to be um, perfectly well intentioned and perfectly legal.
Well, I think you're raising a point about the connection in some people's minds and in reality between the Section 230 debate and the antitrust question, right? So if these companies are private actors and it's not, quote, censorship, or at least it's not a violation of the First Amendment for Google or Facebook or any of those to, cut someone off of their platform, right? But by the same token, if that cutoff is like your death penalty for speaking because you can't have access to the Google platform or the Facebook platform or Amazon's series, then that can seem pretty harsh, and that I think drives some of the concern we're seeing. Again, from both sides, the attacks may be different from the right and the left, but you can see how they kind of coalesce on this point about, is there too much power and control in one speaker? Jericho, any thought on this before we turn the table and let you guys ask some questions of me?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I have been thinking about is in this decision-making process, I don't know that the CEOs and the company should be the only ones making the decision of what gets regulated. So I'm not sure also who else. I think government should be involved. I think the people should be involved. So I'm maybe more collaboration in deciding what is the answer would be something that I think is important.
Great, thank you. Well, as we've discussed, I want to give you a chance to ask me questions about Broadband Breakfast and some of the ways we've gotten here, or just about my background. So, who would like to go first?
Sure. Which one of us is your favorite?
Can't answer that question, Elijah.
Just kidding. Just kidding. My question was, what's been the most challenging thing necessary? As it relates to, the digital infrastructure investment conference, or just events like this about working remotely. We're kind of a remote website anyway. But what has been the most challenging thing about adapting to this sort of tech environment?
Sure, thanks. Great question. So I would say two things. The first is that, and the way I describe it to a lot of people is Broadband Breakfast is really pandemic ready, right? Because we have always been a virtual organization. We certainly, are active in reporting every year. We cover issues throughout the year, but particularly in the summer, we have a strong group of reporters every year, and most of the time we cover things in-person events. But in terms of our interactions as a group, our planning meetings, they're all virtual, right? And so that's kind of, we've been prepared for that, right? But the other side of that is that when every event is a webcast or a webinar, you maybe don't have that same opportunity to worm your way in and learn something, build sources. That's kind of I've been sort of urging you to find new ways, because it's sometimes when you're on a webcast and they can cut you off or not let you in, it's a little hard to say, I'm here, I've got my press pass, I want to cover this event. And so that's kind of the challenge that I would say when you have everything in a webcast mode. It's a little bit harder to push yourself forward.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. But it's been a treat to to have been able to go down to the Hill and attend hearings and things like that.
Yeah,
So thanks for making that
I'm
possible.
glad they finally opened back up. All right, who's got the next question?
Obviously, you've been covering issues in the tech space for a long time, but I think as we've sort of discussed already, just this past year, these past few months have seen a lot of things change very significantly and some in very unexpected ways. So what's been the thing that's surprised you the most in the way that some of these issues that we've been covering for years have played out in the last couple months?
Well, I think that I guess it's not necessarily surprising, but everyone is recognizing that broadband is going to be vital, is vital, and is going to be. It continues to be vital, and so there's really not a question anymore on anyone's side that broadband is going to be part of any infrastructure bill. That there's going to be more effort at broadband for rural areas. I think that should also apply for urban areas and low income areas, and we're going to continue to see progress on that. I have been surprised at how quickly the surface environment towards tech has changed. Right, the atmospherics around the big four tech companies. I still am a little skeptical that it will translate into concrete action, either regulation or antitrust action, because those have got to be based. Antitrust enforcement has to be based upon particular facts and particular evidence of consumer harm, and it's just hard to show consumer harm against what consumers continue to gravitate towards. I guess from a surprising standpoint, I'm surprised that the elections of 2020 remains as imbalanced or one-sided as it seems to be right now. That could change, but I am surprised that the Democrats seem to be appealing to the center, and the president doesn't appear to be appealing to the center, and that's just a unique approach, and I link that to broadband because what we've seen in the 2016 campaign is the way that a political actor can succeed by catering to a base and to the divisions that sometimes seem to be exacerbated by social media. So I guess that's kind of most surprising to me, is that we have such a political imbalance right now on that point.
Something you mentioned a moment ago actually made me think about when you said that you weren't sure how much of this would actually translate into action. I was thinking about how much of the rhetoric around these big tech platforms has really stayed the same over the last year. I mean, we had this big hearing a couple weeks ago with these 4 CEOs, but however groundbreaking that was, a lot of the questions being asked and a lot of the rhetoric and the discussions being had are very, very similar to big tech hearings that were happening a year ago. So how do you think that that's going to play out? I mean, even though there is so much, it seems, anger and distrust from all sides of the political spectrum directed at these companies, is anything actually going to happen to them?
Well, thanks. And let me use that question, Emily, to step back and highlight what can sometimes seem like a disconnect, because we do a lot of coverage about broadband, okay? And who provides broadband? Well, in the US, typically it's these large incumbent players, cable and telecom, that offer sort of vertically integrated packages, and that's one provider. Now, there's many other providers. I don't mean to say they're all there. You have municipalities that provide service. You have competitive local exchange carriers, so-called CLECs. You have wireless internet service providers. You even have satellite providers. So there is a broad ecosystem of broadband providers. But when we think about broadband providers, we're thinking about the infrastructure providers, right? And then when we think of big tech like Facebook and Google, we're talking about the edge players, right? The tech companies that have not typically, now Google Fiber, Google took an interesting detour into being an infrastructure provider through Google Fiber, but for the most part, Google, Facebook, et cetera, they're on the edge, right? They're not in the kind of core broadband networks. And so, okay, who's the villain, right? During the Obama administration, the big telecom companies tended to be more of the villain, right? And so you had a push towards net neutrality, and that was a push against broadband providers, and you just haven't heard much about that. I mean, obviously, net neutrality was reversed by the Obama Ajit Pai FCC in 2017, and we are living in a world where there's no net neutrality regulations at the moment. I should say there's very limited. There's transparency rules, but other than that, there is no net neutrality rules. And yet we're seeing all of this attention and focus on tech and all these concerns about tech, and the telecom lobbyists are just tickled pink that all of the attention and anger, so to speak, is on the tech companies right now. So what's going to happen in the future? Again, I'm going to peer into my crystal ball. If we were to have a different administration, a different from the one we have right now, you're going to see the pendulum swing back a little bit, or maybe a lot, and you're going to see more of a focus on net neutrality, and you're going to see the telecom providers under greater scrutiny. Now, that the tech guys are not going to get off scot-free either, because there's been new concerns raised about privacy, about platform strangulation, and so forth. And so I think all of these things are going to get thrown into the stew, and there is, in I'd say 2 to 4 years, going to be some big tech bill. I don't know exactly what, but it could be around privacy with a net neutrality component. It could be, again, a net neutrality bill that sort of leaps into privacy. And one of our commentators is asking about privacy there. That's how it's going to come together. There's going to be a major push to update, let's call them tech and telecom laws. And it's going to have to settle the net neutrality issue, because that's a political ping pong that goes back and forth with every administration. And that's just not good for, certainty. So we're going to have to see Congress wrestle with net neutrality. I think they will also end up wrestling with privacy. They may tweak Section 230 when they do that. That's kind of, my view into the future.
All right. Speaking of the future, I had a question for you, Drew. So how have the website's priorities adapted through the years, and how do you see Broadband Breakfast evolving in the future?
Thanks, Jericho. Great question. So we started Broadband Breakfast as Broadband Census in 2008, 12 years ago. And the goal at the time, it actually grew out of a lawsuit I was responsible for activating at another organization against the Federal Communications Commission to get broadband data. They had the Form 477 data, which is a database about broadband availability by carrier at the census. Wasn't census block level then, but anyway, they had the data and they wouldn't release it. And we tried to get it under the Freedom of Information Act. Well, we lost the battle, but we won the war, in that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act did insert a provision that said there shall be a national broadband map collected, which included information about who provided broadband at a census block level. So broadband census kind of started off as a way to go around the initial loss and crowdsource the collection of broadband data. So we were very much focused on the infrastructure piece almost exclusively, right? And Broadband Breakfast came along within 9 months of broadband census, because I'm a journalist by background. I'm also an attorney. Wasn't at the time, but I've since become an attorney, and I work in the field of broadband and telecommunications. But as a journalist and someone who follows this topic, I said we really need to have coverage and policy and industry viewpoints that bring people back to the site. So I would say, Jericho, that we really started off with much more of an infrastructure focus. Now, as the Recovery Act proceeded, we started to broaden that to, we called it broadband's impact, right? So the impact it has on health, on telemedicine, on education, on economic development, family connectedness, agriculture, all of those kind of aspects of connectivity are a real part of our mission. And I would say that over the last 3 or 4 years, we've kind of gone even more broad in the sense of focusing on privacy coverage, focusing on issues of social media and the regulation of social media. So, you have to adapt to the times, right? I mean, what we're doing right now is a response to the pandemic and the fact that we can't meet in person. We can't have our traditional Broadband Breakfast Club meetings that we are known for. And so that's one way to adapt, is to say, what do the times require and how can we respond to it, meet a market need of providing insight and analysis into broadband issues.
Thanks, Drew.
Any other questions? Who else? Elijah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to hear your opinion. I never got to hear your opinion on Michael O'Reilly and the future of that seat.
That is a great question. And we had last week Mignon Clyburn on this show. Mignon was the former FCC commissioner, former acting chair. And when I asked her about that, she said, well, that not much surprises me, but that surprised me. And what we're talking about is the Trump administration withdrawing the reappointment of Commissioner Michael O'Reilly. He was, assured, all but assured of getting another term. He's been there. He may forget my memory whether he's been there 2 terms or 1 term already, but 1 term already. Okay, Jericho. 2 terms. Okay, 2 fingers. I missed. So this would have been his 3rd term. Now he might not have had a full 5-year term before, but in any case, he was all but assured of that until his nomination was withdrawn. And the scuttlebutt, the reporting seems to be that was pretty much exclusively over his non-enthusiastic embrace of Section 230 regulation, which not everyone, most people agree is really not going to go forward through the FCC, at least. Maybe Congress will change 230, but not through the FCC. So what's going to happen with that seat? Well, here's what's getting interesting, because Commissioner O'Reilly's seat technically expired in 2019. Now, under the law, that means he can stay until the next year, until the last day Congress is in session, until it adjourns sine die in 2020. So he's effectively not there, but he because the laws can stay until the end of Congress's session this year. Now, I suppose President Trump could put forward another name, but it'd have to get approved by the Senate. So conceivably, the seat disappears, right? Now, I mean, again, I come back to the politics, right? If the election in November switches parties, then the Democratic Party will have the opportunity to have 3 commissioners on the FCC instead of just 2. So they'd have to lose 1 anyway. So it might mean that, Chairman Pai can stay on the FCC and just become a commissioner. Again, this is all in the hypothetical that President Trump loses re-election and there's a Democrat in the White House, because the party in the White House picks the chairman of the FCC among the commissioners, among the 5 commissioners. So there's a lot of ways this could go. Unclear whether we'll get a new nomination and it'll get through. It certainly raises the politicization of the FCC. That's what we're seeing on a massive scale with this administration, with the Trump administration.
And Jericho,
sort of in that line of looking forward to.
Let's let Emily ask a question. Yeah.
This is slightly unrelated, so if Elijah has something directly following that, he should go. But what I was going to ask is basically just looking forward to the future, as some of these issues are becoming more politicized or sort of coming to a point where decisions might be being made, regulation might be getting passed. What do you think is one of the most important stories to be following over the next few years in the realm of broadband issues?
We at Broadband Breakfast have really championed the importance, and I want to back up a bit here. We really are not one that wants to take sides. I mean, like, I have particular views on net neutrality, for instance, but we're going to report straight out on the whole issue. We're going to follow that. We're going to go in depth into what net neutrality means and its impact. Same thing about broadband mapping, right? I mean, I have very strong views on broadband mapping, but we're going to cover that issue thoroughly and fairly. We also have really focused on open access issues. And again, I think that this is an issue most of the country is not yet awake to. We focused our conference 2 days ago on issues of, this is the digital infrastructure and investment. And Emily, thank you for all of your help in preparing for that event, which we've recorded and will broadcast at the Broadband Communities Virtual Summit in September. That event brought together experts in this field of wholesale provision of service, open access, municipalities that are involved in broadband, the financing, because I don't think it's a sure thing that the same companies the Comcasts, the AT&Ts, the Verizons that have been the major players in the US broadband market will necessarily continue to be so. That is to say, if they are on their current pattern of, hey, we need to own it, we need to operate it, we need to control the services, because we will benefit as a country if we have more competition on the services, if we have faster, i.e. symmetrical gigabit connections, which are largely available through fiber, but there are some wireless technologies that will allow that. And increasingly, we're seeing a kind of a hybrid ecosystem. So I'm kind of merging from my first reaction, Emily, to my second one. The first one is open access and greater role for wholesale and shared infrastructure. And the second piece that kind of ties into this is hybrid networks, where wireless and fiber are part and parcel of the networks, and you just use the best technology. For example, I've been involved in some projects that are trying to build high capacity networks in residential areas. We could call them fiber to the home, but they also need to use a gigabit or a high capacity radio microwave signal from one point to another. That may be necessary. So you're going to have a kind of a combination of wired and wireless networks, and so the borders between different types of technology will continue to break up. So that's two responses to your question there about broadband.
All right, I have a question about Monday's event, and I just wanted to know if you learned anything new or any new ideas that could be implemented that you also learned from the webinar.
Yeah,
so the digital infrastructure investment.
Sure. One area I'm keen to learn a lot more about is the way that infrastructure, wireless and wired infrastructure, can piggyback on municipalities and areas that want to be involved. One of our guests, Dean Bubley from the United Kingdom, one of a couple guests from the United Kingdom at one Monday's event, spoke about how some rural communities in England have actually, bought or gotten involved in owning the infrastructure that could enable open radio access networks in their communities. So I want to learn more about that. That's an area I don't know quite as much about as the others. And so from a perspective of what we're going to see more of, I think we could see a lot more in this infrastructure, municipalities being involved. The more you get involved in this space, you get, I guess you could say, better and nerd to the nonsense that some people make, which is that government-owned networks. I mean, I'm sorry, it's such a nonsense term because we're not really talking about government-owned networks. The government owns the streets. The government owns the sidewalks. You can call them public goods if you want to, but because of that, the government is going to have a role in the rights of way and in the infrastructure that sits in those rights of way, whether it's towers or whether it's fiber or whether it's fiber huts. And so because that government role in the infrastructure, you want to be open to government infrastructure, a pipe or a communications utility. Our friend Sean is really commenting a lot here. That's awesome. Thank you for your attention and focus on this. That is a lively prospect that we could see a lot more of, and particularly when you can break it apart into a network that someone else plays an operational role, and services, advanced services, come across that. That's what I see a lot more in the future, and I hope to see a lot more in the future too.
I want to touch on another question that we just got via Facebook from Val Mead, who asked about the big tech hearing and how Congress, or a lot of members of Congress, are suggesting that Google, Facebook, etc., are too big.
Yeah.
Very complicated political, but interesting solutions you've heard.
So yeah, thanks for that question. And Emily has reported a lot on Section 230, and one of the ideas I think I first learned about from one of your stories was the notion of someone curating another entity's algorithm, right? So I don't know enough to know whether that's a good idea or not, but I'd like to know more about it. I'd like to know how some entity, let's say ACLU, could curate a feed on Facebook, and I could subscribe to the ACLU feed, and because I haven't a clue why I see certain people and certain events and certain ideas on Facebook and not others, right? I suppose it's because that's what my friends or my likes or whatever are, or the people I've said or the people I've clicked on. But that's not good enough. You want to know more. You want to know why I'm getting seen, I'm being shown, and I am therefore seeing certain things, and other people are seeing different things. Because this is kind of part of the big picture. Part of the dissatisfaction with tech coming out of 2016 is that, well, some people are seeing one world and some people are seeing another. And so it's no surprise that Trump supporters saw one world and voted for Trump, and Clinton supporters saw one world and voted for her. And so, this is kind of a long feared issue that people have raised about the news and the future of news. And it's been criticized, it's been poo-pooed. Maybe I poo-pooed it, but I think there is a real concern there of not knowing why I'm seeing what I'm seeing. And so, to Val, thanks for your question. I think that a solution might be exploring ways that we can unpack algorithms and allow others to mediate algorithms on platforms. Next question.
All right, this is a simple one, but what's your favorite part of being editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast?
I think it's when people email me or call me and say, I really like this idea, or I like this concept. You're focused on something that others aren't paying attention to, or bringing some issues to light. We take our name, Broadband Breakfast, from the Broadband Breakfast Club that we started in 2008, and it really was a gathering place for people in Washington to focus on broadband policy and internet technology. And since we can't gather physically at the moment, we're gathering online, right, through Broadband Breakfast Live online. So it's, I know a lot of media companies do events, right, and that's kind of become part of the, I don't want to say DNA yet, but it's getting to be part of the fabric of media entities. For us, it's the center, right? It's really part of what we're trying to do, is to be a connector of people through our journalism and through our events. So I'd say that the most fun part of it is to be able to think about and put together these events that can bring people together. Now, they may have completely different interests, right? They may have, okay, well, we don't want open access, we do want open access, or they may say we're for net neutrality and we're against net neutrality, or any variety of mixes in there. But at least there's something that they can find in common in learning factual and smart and substantive information on such topics. All right, we have time for one or two more questions. So, Elijah, I think you have a question, don't you?
I had one for Jericho, but I just wanted to hear more about, what he was like, but what Michael O'Reilly was like, but that's all right. That's past.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll invite Michael on to talk to us, and hopefully he'll accept. I know Michael. We've interacted quite a bit in the past, and I'd love to hear his version about his time at the FCC.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I think he was just silent for PR purposes. I'm sure they told him it was better to be silent than to. And he submitted all his stuff for the record if anyone wants to read it. But yeah, he was just silent during the last FCC meeting. That was probably what Elijah was interested in.
Yeah, interesting. I would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. But my question was, what do you think is the future of Chinese tech in America? Whether it's Donald Trump or Mike Pompeo or formerly John Bolton. Our leadership just hates China, but it seems that they're able to deliver extremely low cost, at least to my understanding, relatively high quality infrastructure for 5G and things like that. So the interplay between those is interesting. And excuse the truck, but what do you think is the future of that?
Yeah, no, thanks for raising the issue of China, and particularly in telecom equipment. That's another issue that's kind of surprised me, is how strongly the anti-China trend has been and just continues, right? I mean, it wasn't too long ago, maybe just 3 or 4 years, that Huawei was like a viable company for players. I mean, still a viable company globally, don't get me wrong, but it was like a real option that rural broadband providers were looking to for filling out their networks. And I continue to be one that says, okay, I'm willing to listen to arguments, but where is the evidence that Huawei's equipment is sniffing and monitoring? We kind of went from one position to 180-degree position, from pro or open Huawei to anti-Huawei, without any evidence. It just based on anti-Chinese protectionism that has come about, and I think that's what's driving the other issues. Again, let's see what evidence there is about TikTok and data, but we've kind of gone from one position to another. So like many things, whenever we get a new administration, whether it's in January or in the future, it's not going to flip these positions on China, because a lot of the Democrats are also being very hawkish about Chinese equipment and Chinese role. So I mean, my attitude is that it's unfortunate that our two countries are on such a collision course, but at the same time, when you look at China's aggression in Hong Kong in the last couple of weeks, and the South China Seas, I mean, those give many people, including myself, pause and say, well, we have to combat those and react to those. So if you have no other tools, I guess you go after their companies, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you all for being with us, for being willing to participate in this program, this experiment, and thank you, all of you, for your role and your contributions to Broadband Breakfast over the past several months. Before we conclude, I just want to thank you for watching this episode of Broadband Breakfast Live Online, and invite you to next week, when I will be interviewing Tom Hazlett, professor at Clemson University, and really a kind of a giant in the field of telecommunications research and analysis. Thank you again. Visit us at Broadband Breakfast.